Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening at the My IBD Learning webinar series. My name's Andrea Wilimowski, and I am a clinical trial ambassador in a patient with ulcerative colitis. So I'm really pleased to be facilitating tonight's program. And today's webinar is going to be focused on IBD research and how you can participate in clinical trials. And we're going to discuss future therapies in the pipeline of clinical research, goal of participating in IBD research, and how you can participate in clinical research. So the My IBD Learning webinar series features different educational topics throughout the year, and we invite you, the Foundation's upcoming My IBD Learning webinars and in-person regional events at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation.org/My IBD Learning. And a few housekeeping reminders just before we begin tonight. The program is being recorded and it will be accessible after the completion of tonight's program to view. So it is being recorded. And if you have questions for the presenters tonight during the program or during our Q&A, you can enter those in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we possibly can. And if you're interested in the live closed captioning, you can access that by clicking on the bar below and the CC button at the bottom, and then you click on show subtitles. And if you don't see that option, you might need to download the latest version of Zoom. You might not be updated all the way. So now I'd like to introduce the evening's expert and panelists who we'll be hearing from tonight. We're very excited to have Dr. Jordan Axelrad. He is a gastroenterologist at NYU's Langone's Inflammatory Bowel Disease Center in New York City, focusing on the care of people with inflammatory bowel disease, of ulcerative colitis, and of course, Crohn's disease. His clinical and research interests include malignant and infectious complications of IBD, and he aims to understand how gastrointestinal infections can complicate IBD or even trigger it to develop. And of course, his ultimate goal is finding a prevention or a cure. I hope that happens. We're also going to hear some patient stories from members of the Foundation's Clinical Trials Ambassador Program. And if you don't know, clinical trial ambassadors are patient volunteers who work with the Foundation to increase awareness and clinical trials and encourage patients to speak with their providers a little bit more about clinical trials and even discuss that as an option in their care. So I really thank you all for being here today. And at this time, I want to pass it over to Dr. Axelrad, who will be discussing future and emerging therapies in IBD research. So Dr. Axelrad, I will hand this over to you.
Right. Thank you, Andrea. So in our brief time today, I'm going to review about emerging and new IBD therapies. We're first going to talk about treat to target approach, which really underlies our management strategy for inflammatory bowel disease therapies. We'll review some future therapies and pipeline agents. We'll talk about the goals of those therapies. And then we'll end on the goal of participating in IBD research and how folks can participate, which are greatly needed. So I just want to start with treat to target, which is a new philosophy in inflammatory bowel disease management. Many years ago, we used to just treat patients' symptoms, right? So if a patient felt better, we'd say, okay, their drug worked. In 2022, that's not good enough. And we always want to identify a target that we're achieving when we start a new IBD medication. So the most frequently target in our medications that we're thinking about is healing the gut, right? So if there are ulcers, you want to make sure that that gut is healed. And healing the gut is important because it's not just associated with improved symptoms, so that patient's feeling better, but it's also directly linked to improved outcomes. So in Crohn's disease, maybe that's less stricturing. In ulcerative colitis, maybe that's a lower risk of colectomy. And until we achieve that mucosal healing, we're continuing to readjust our approach and optimize management to get us there. So maybe we're frequently checking labs or stool studies or frequent endoscopy just to make sure that we're achieving that target. Many years ago, we also used to think about IBD therapies as you always start with the quote, safest and least effective and work your way up to, the most effective, but perhaps the medication with more side effects. Nowadays, we really don't think about medications in that way. And I'm not a huge fan of the whole pyramid model, but I think this does a nice job of illustrating that nowadays we think about the right medication for the right patient. And we do that based on a patient's individualized risk profile and disease activity and severity. And so it may be that starting an IBD therapy that's most effective, such as biologic agents or small molecules, upfront, very early in the disease course, is actually better. And there's lots of data demonstrating that starting these medications earlier is associated with improved long-term outcomes, less surgery, less complications, less stricture, less fistula. And so it's very important that we're not just starting with what we perceive to be safest and least effective, but what's the right medication for the right patient. And so in thinking about the targets of future therapies in the pipeline, which is so important for all of us here, we have to also think about what we think causes IBD. So we know that IBD is caused by environmental factors and changes in the gut microbiome in genetically susceptible individuals that leads to an aberrant immune response. A lot of our existing therapies have really focused primarily on that immune response. And in the next 10, 20, 30 years of IBD drug development, obviously while working towards a cure, a lot of medications are going to start to focus on some of these other aspects of what may be causing or may be associated with inflammatory bowel disease onset and flares. So it's really important to keep that in mind. All right, so a little bit of a busy slide here, but just to sort of mention some of the targets of current and future IBD therapies. And so, of course, the gut microbiome is a big area of research and trying to understand how that relates to disease, how changing the gut microbiome can improve disease, a big area of research. T cells or the immune compartment, which also includes lymph nodes, is a huge aspect of inflammatory bowel disease treatment and research. We know that there are drugs like JAK inhibitors that target the JAK-STAT pathway that's over here. We have new drugs that are starting to target lymph nodes, ozanimod or Zeposia, that helps to prevent the trafficking of white cells out of lymph nodes to the gut. And you'll see some familiar names on here, like vedolizumab or Entyvio down here at the blood cell, which helps to prevent white cells from trafficking to the gut through blood cells. And of course, drugs like infliximab and adalimumab, Remicade, Humira, which act on TNF, which is a cytokine and inflammatory mediator. These drugs help prevent the downstream effects of these cytokines by blocking the receptors. So what are the goals of future therapies? Well, there are many, right? We know that our medications overall, we do not have that many options and they do not work super well. In any given time, only about half of patients are in endoscopic remission. And so there's a lot of missing parts of IBD treatment that require further study. Also, once you've gone through our few agents, now we oftentimes feel like nothing is working. And sometimes we're sort of reinventing the wheel, combining agents, using different dosages, different frequency of drug. There's lots of things that we can do. But again, there's a huge unmet need for therapies that just work better. And not only work better, but they need to work for a longer period of time. Many of our drugs may only work for a couple of months to years, and then sometimes patients lose that response. There are many reasons for that, but it's a huge drawback of many of our therapies. Therapy safety is a big, important goal of future therapies. This is the number one question that patients ask me, right? Well, how safe is this drug? Not how well is it going to work, but is this drug going to give me a side effect? Is it going to give me an infection? Is it going to cause cancers? So we definitely need safer therapies that are more targeted. Convenience is a big factor, right? Infusions can be incredibly disruptive, especially for patients who are younger, or traveling, for folks who travel a lot for work or who don't travel, just wasting time going to an infusion center can really be time consuming. And of course, just we need more targeted, precise medications that have fewer side effects and are directed towards an individual patient's needs. So in recent years, we've seen a lot of movement in this small molecule space. So these differ from biologics, which have been around for many decades now, in that they tend to be oral. They're a little bit easier to take because of that. They are not proteins. So the body does not recognize a small molecule and create an antibody to that. So the risk of this immunogenicity, your body reacting to the biologic and causing an antibody, doesn't happen with small molecules. And because they're oral, you don't have to worry about injections or infusions. And so there's lots of benefits here. But again, this is just one aspect of the pipeline and newer agents and emerging agents that we're seeing today. So these are some examples of emerging therapies. Many of these on this list are actually small molecules. So I'll actually start from the bottom. JAK kinase inhibitors, JAK inhibitors. We already have 2 now that are FDA approved and used here in the United States. Upadacitinib, which is Rinvoq, just received approval in ulcerative colitis. We have Xeljanz or tofacitinib, which has been approved for many years now in ulcerative colitis. We have S1P receptor modulators like ozanimod and Tracimod, which is under study. Ozanimod's been approved, that's Zeposia in ulcerative colitis. And there's many agents now also under study looking just at one cytokine called IL-23. And that may sound familiar because it's also a target of Stelara, ustekinumab, which many of us are on. And so these are just more targeted agents that work a little bit differently. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then there's other agents which also fall under the small molecule and anti-integrin sort of headline. And these also include things like subcutaneous vedolizumab, which is not yet approved in the United States, but may be a little bit easier for patients to take. So these are a lot of emerging therapies, some of which are starting to become approved, and we're going to review a few of these. All right, so back to our busy picture here. I just want to focus actually primarily on pipeline agents that are recently or have become approved. So we're going to focus on JAK inhibitors, primarily upadacitinib, Rinvoq, which recently received approval for colitis. It's under study in Crohn's disease. We're going to talk about S1P receptor modulators, which are targeting targets in the lymph node, so ozanimod or Zeposia, and a Tracimod, which is under study as well. And we'll talk about agents that target IL-23, which is a huge area of research, and we're likely to see many agents approved just targeting IL-23, similar to Stelara, but a little bit different. Stelara targets 12 and 23. Many of these agents just target the IL-23 receptor, so we're going to talk a little bit about these agents. All right, again, lots of bar graphs. The point of this slide is to introduce everyone to Rinvoq, upadacitinib. So this is a selective JAK inhibitor. It differs a little bit from what we already know with Xeljanz. And what's really important about this medication is that it works quickly, and it's been shown to be extremely effective in patients who have failed prior biologic therapies, in particular anti-TNF agents. And that's very important because many patients have already been exposed to many biologics, and you need a drug that's going to work quickly and that's going to be effective for this refractory group. What's also important to point out is that we're getting endoscopic improvement rates above 50% here, and that we don't often see, especially in maintenance. So this is really encouraging data. And I also just want to highlight that while it's been approved in colitis, it's not yet approved in Crohn's disease. There is promising data for JAK inhibitors in Crohn's disease where we don't have any approvals yet. So this is top-line data that AbbVie just released a couple of months ago. And you could see here that upadacitinib, Rinvoq at 45 milligrams was very effective in Crohn's disease. Again, we're not getting rates of 100%, 90%, but pretty good signals here that this drug has some efficacy in Crohn's disease. So we look forward to more data and for having another option in Crohn's disease. I also want to highlight Zeposia or ozanimod. Again, this works at the lymph node. This differing than Rinvoq or Xeljanz has been shown to have greater efficacy in patients who have not been exposed to other agents. So maybe this is an emerging therapy that's recently approved for a patient who's never been exposed to any biologic or small molecule medications, that this drug may work a little bit better. Also works quickly, it's approved in UC. And again, you could see here that compared to placebo, we're not getting rates of clinical response and endoscopic response in induction and maintenance of 100 or 80%. But yes, the drug is effective. It's more effective than placebo. This clearly also demonstrates some of our unmet need. Tracimod is similar to ozanimod in that it functions at this S1P receptor at the lymph nodes, but this remains under study. These are the data here you could see in ulcerative colitis patients. It has a shorter half-life than Zeposia, so perhaps this could be a safer drug, although we don't have any data yet to support that. And what's important about this is that it's actually been shown in some top-line data that's been released by Arena Pharmaceuticals and Pfizer, who are studying this drug, that differing than Zeposia, this seems to be pretty effective in patients who have failed biologics. And so it's important to figure out what that broader data is going to look like, and we look forward to more. But again, S1P receptor modulators, Zeposia, Tracimod, these are medications that are going to be important for our patients. All right, again, a very busy slide. The whole point is just to mention that targeting IL-23 is a huge target that's going to be very important in inflammatory bowel disease. There are multiple agents that are in phase 3 and that are readying for approval, submission to the FDA. These include drugs that you may have already heard about because they're approved in other disease states like Tremfya or Skyrizi, risankizumab. And so the point here is that all of these agents that target IL-23, similar to Stelara, which targets IL-12/23, have really good efficacy. Again, we're not getting that 180%, but we're getting good efficacy. There's also some studies that are ongoing, in particular for Tremfya, combining this medication in ulcerative colitis with golimumab, which is an anti-TNF agent, somewhat similar maybe to Humira. And that we're even getting even better response rates. But of course, we need to understand what the side effect profile looks like that. But the most important point that I want everyone to take home is that new agents that target IL-23 are going to be emerging, and that this is likely to be highly effective in both Crohn's and colitis. Again, not 100%, but pretty good response rates in induction and maintenance. And these seem to be safer agents as well. So we look forward to more data and getting some of these agents approved as options for our patients. Okay, but where are we all going with this, right? So I just said that we need to focus in the beginning of this talk outside of just the immune compartment, right? We need to focus on genetics, the microbiome. We need to focus on the environment. And so what's happening is we're seeing a lot of data being compiled that's really focused on finding out the right medication for an individual patient. And we know that a lot of us have experienced that when you start a medication, yourself, your doctor, your treatment team, we have no idea if you're going to respond, right? And while we wait and wait and wait for that drug to respond, we end up losing a lot of time. And that can be very stressful, not just for patients, but also for doctors. And we want to be able to identify the right drug for the right patients. We don't waste that time. We don't risk having that time period where you may be at risk of complications. And so we're seeing this sort of multifaceted approach that's emerging in inflammatory bowel disease, where we're taking genetic markers, we're taking gut microbiome markers, we're trying to understand the inflammatory profile of a patient and integrating that into response profiles of patients. And that's why participating in research of any kind is so important. And especially if it's looking at why patients respond to drug, is we want to know what's unique about patients who take a drug and do fantastic and heal up their gut and stay healthy. We want to know what that is. And this way we can identify patterns and use that medication in that right patient profile. So here's a good diagram that shows, patients are all different. We have different backgrounds, different inflammatory backgrounds, different gut microbiomes, different genetics, and identifying the right drug for the right patient. And that's going to require a lot of data and a lot of study. And research has the potential to really take this guesswork, and you don't lose that time, but we need a lot more studies. Research can also provide many insights into the natural history of disease, right? Things like cancer risk, risks of surgery. We already talked a little bit about discovery of new treatments and identifying the right, most effective treatment for the right patient. It's important to participate in research so we understand the safety of these drugs, right? The safety is the #1 question that I get asked about drugs. We also need research to understand how to optimize our drugs, right? So if I have a patient that comes in that's on a drug and they said, okay, well, I'm doing a little bit better, but not great. We need to try to understand how to best optimize the situation so we don't burn through drug after drug and we only have a couple of drugs approved. And of course, we need more research to understand how to talk to patients better about utilizing these medications, that these shouldn't be scary infusion, chemo-like agents, that these are medications that can help restore a patient's quality of life, keep them out of the hospital, prevent them from surgery. And we only get there with participation in research from the IBD community. And sort of similar on that whole vein is also understanding the right diagnosis and the right biomarker testing so that maybe we don't need to do so much endoscopy. Maybe we don't need to do so many MRIs. Maybe we can find good, useful surrogates that are easy to measure and easy to follow so that we can avoid some of these more invasive and time-consuming procedures. And I just want to end, really focusing on the clinical trial component, because participation in clinical trials seems very scary. And for any of you who are listening, where your doctors are involved in clinical trials, we're always talking to you about them. These are so important. And they're important not just because we want to do experiments on patients and see what happens, but we want to improve the lives of the IBD community. And generally, when drugs make it to a large clinical trial, there's already signals that this drug may work and signals that this drug is safe. And it's so important that we get the right patients into these trials so that we can understand whether these drugs are going to be effective in the IBD population, advance our knowledge, learn about risks, and demonstrate efficacy and safety. These are so important. And so I really look forward to that. And this is what I talk to patients about. Clinical trials, they don't need to be just because you failed everything. They can be because you want to learn, you want to participate in something new, and maybe there's the opportunities to participate in something that can change the field. Okay. And of course, I sort of reached about this, but not only does participation in trials help you to get engaged, with your doctor better, but you reach a whole community of industry and healthcare. A lot of people are watching you and keeping their eye on you, and it's a really great way to get involved in research in a significant, meaningful way. So if your doctor doesn't participate in trials, certainly you can reach out to me. We can talk about trials if you're interested. But again, this doesn't have to be just because you've burned through many other drugs. This can be an opportunity to try something that can be more effective and safer, and also, of course, help the community. All right, and on that note, I will turn it back over to Andrea.
Thank you so much, Dr. Axelrad. The presentation, I can't even pronounce half the words that you just did, and it's always so informative to hear someone that is so intelligent and so focused on this, and we just really appreciate your information. And of course, at the end, you spoke about, and we learned about the importance of participating in IBD clinical trials. And now we're going to hear about the Foundation's resource, the clinical trials community. It's there to assist anyone interested in learning about clinical trials or looking for a trial near you. So the Foundation's clinical trials community is a resource to help you. You can learn how clinical trials are done and what the process is like to enroll. You can get information on clinical research from the experts. You can engage with patients and caregivers who are willing to offer their support and their stories for you. And you can also find clinical trials near you on the Ibd Trial Finder. It's excellent. You can find clinical trials near or far. And at the clinical trials community, you can find the following resources online. You can find clinical trial resources for children and adults, including infographics, videos. You can read patient perspectives on clinical trials and hear their stories, read their stories. You can stay up to date on IBD clinical trial listings. Again, in that trial finder, it's excellent. You can stay up to date with research happenings in the clinical trial newsletters that are sent out, and those are great resources. You can also actually engage with clinical trial ambassadors like myself and others to learn firsthand experience of somebody who has participated in a clinical trials, and we're there to answer questions for you. And for more information, I do encourage you to check out the clinical trial community website. It's listed below. And tonight I want to pass this along to a fellow clinical trial ambassador, Vishal, and I'm going to have him share his story with you tonight. Vishal?
Great, thanks, Andrea. So hi, everyone. My name is Vishal Sethi, and I'm a clinical trials ambassador with the foundation. I wanted to first say thank you to CCF for having me on the panel today, and to Dr. Axelrad for a very informative presentation. So a bit on my background, I've had ulcerative colitis for about 16 years. And I'd spent most of that first 10 years kind of going through the usual medication routine, you know, being stable on one medication for a few years and then ultimately failing it. And then eventually my disease got bad enough to where I'd received surgery to remove my colon, or a colectomy as they call it, in 2016. And since then I've had a J pouch, which basically they use your small intestines as kind of a makeshift large intestines. So my first experience with a clinical trial was in 2016. I was in the midst of trying different medications to help me feel better. And I ended up getting a blood clot. And I was prescribed an injection medication to take, you know, once a day, kind of a small subcutaneous injection. And a doctor had come into the hospital when I was in the hospital, and they had told me that there was a trial going on at that hospital. And if I basically, you would either get the injection as normal, or you would be randomized to take a pill. Obviously, that's a lot better than getting a needle poke every day. The drug actually was already approved in adults, and it was shown to be very safe with very few side effects, which is relieving. The trial was, you know, to get it approved in pediatrics. So I entered the trial. I got the pill through randomization, which was very great. And overall, it was a good experience. So I had to kind of keep a daily journal, you know, mark down that I took the pill twice a day and document any side effects. And I had none. And I talked with my doctor kind of when I was on the medication, you know, how am I feeling, and et cetera. And so once my 3-month period of taking the medication was up, I came off the trial. I'd say that was a very positive experience. And the drug is soon to be approved in a pediatric population in the upcoming years. And so a few years later, this was after I had surgery, and I was kind of having a few issues with my J pouch and some inflammation. And then I was kind of just thinking, maybe I'll look on the, you know, Clinical Trials Finder and see if anything is new there. So I opened the website and I typed in kind of the complication I was having. And I saw a recently opened trial. It was maybe posted just a few weeks, you know, prior to me looking at the website. It was at a hospital where I lived, but I hadn't got care from that hospital before. So, and I had an email of someone, so I just sent them an email saying I was interested, and we connected. And obviously my doctor was informed of this, and they were helped out with the process. And we chatted, and they deemed that I was eligible for this trial. And so we obviously met in person, had an appointment, and I got enrolled into the trial. And this was actually also an approved drug. It was approved in one disease, and they were trying it basically in IBD. And so I knew it was safe. It had been on the market for many years, and so I felt comfortable taking it as well. Both trials I was on didn't really experience many side effects at all. You know, both drugs are rather very safe, and similar to the first trial. You know, I had a diary every day, you know, mark down that I'm taking the medicine. I had to go to the doctor for this one every 4 weeks to kind of get a blood test and monitor my blood levels, and to kind of let them know how I was feeling, fill out a few forms. So I did this for about 6 months. Unfortunately, the medicine wasn't really working, so I came off the trial. But overall, the experience was good as well. You know, I talked with my doctor. I kind of went over risks and questions and concerns, and documenting the experience in the journal. Both were oral drugs. You know, I can just take it home. And a bit atypical. Both of the trials I was in were for drugs that were already approved, whereas a lot of clinical trials are for drugs that aren't approved, right? That's kind of the point of the trial. So a bit of atypical experience, but overall, I would say it's a positive takeaways. So kind of in summary, going over details and questions and risks with your doctor and making sure that you're educated, I think is very important. I think one of the main reasons I felt comfortable with everything is that I spent the time to talk with my doctor and read stuff online to kind of get educated on the matter and get an idea of what was going on. And like Dr. Axelrad mentioned, I think doing a clinical trial isn't necessarily reserved for the last line of treatment. You know, often drugs can be effective and safe, you know, in clinical trials. And if it can help you feel better, you know, that is definitely what matters most. And an added bonus is the courage you take and by participating in that trial, which helps future patients, because every drug that patients take, you know, ones that we're familiar with, Remicade or Humira, which are approved for IBD, they had clinical trials for those drugs back in the day. And so if you can, you know, be part of that, that's all the better. And yeah, so not every, you know, clinical trial experience that everyone experiences may be great, because, you know, healthcare can be very tough and complex and intimidating sometimes. But at the end of the day, if it's something that can make you or help you feel better, especially for a longer period of time, I think it's well worth your time and effort to learn more about it and to ask your doctor, you know, doc, am I a good candidate for clinical trials, and have the discussion there, you know, and have them answer any questions and give you advice on, you know, your treatment plan as necessary. But in any event, appreciate everyone taking the time to listen. And with that, I'll pass it back to Andrea.
Thank you, Vishal. I appreciate it. It's always great to hear a fellow clinical trial ambassador share their story. And I'm going to just share with you my story. It may or may not go along with the slides too well, but if I miss something, you know, I've said the story many times. My journey actually started, I was on The Biggest Loser on NBC. And that was in 2015, and I had lost 100 pounds in a very quick time period. And I was completely healthy and nothing was wrong with me. And one day I got sick overnight and never had any problems at all. And went in the hospital, not as a result of being on the show, but because I thought I had food poisoning. 7 days later, I came out of the hospital, and I'd always heard of Crohn's disease, but I'd never heard of ulcerative colitis. And I had a very severe form of that. And that was in May of 2016. And immediately they assigned me an IBD doctor, a GI physician, because unless you have a GI problem, you usually don't have any idea where to find a GI doctor. So I was given one, and they put me on a very, very extreme treatment because I had a very severe case of disease, like I said, overnight, and went on a biologic. And I was on it for about 8 months. At about the 7-month time period, I had severe joint problems. My UC was doing really good with this, but by the 7th month, I was in a wheelchair, and he really didn't have any idea of why. Never asked me about a clinical trial, never even suggested one, and said, oh, we should, you know, surgery is your option. Well, I didn't like that option right then. And I'm a Googler, and I call myself a Dr. Google. And I went on the internet, and I decided I was going to go. I'm in Grosse Pointe Woods, Michigan, which is just north of Detroit and very close to a very well-known hospital / school in Ann Arbor. Even though I'm a Spartan, I still went. So it saved my life, actually. They do tons of clinical trials there. And I met with a doctor, and he said, you know, I think you have formed antibodies to this drug. And so the bad part was that I had to go off of all medications to flush that out of my system. But he was right. And within 3 weeks, I was out of a wheelchair, and it had given me drug-induced lupus. And that was the reason why I was having such a problem. So there was no going back, and there really wasn't anything approved for me that I could take that was as strong. So he suggested a clinical trial, and I didn't really know what it was, Googled away. I met the clinical trial coordinator who absolutely fell in love with, and I can't tell people enough that that person is a very integral part of the whole team of people. And we got along. I asked tons of questions and I probably drove her nuts. She let me text her and call her. And finally I said, you know what? I don't want to live like this the rest of my life, and I want to help other people. And so I went ahead and I did a double-blind study. And for those of you that don't know, that means nobody knows if you're on the drug or if you're on the placebo. And about 12 weeks in, I wasn't feeling any different. And we went in for a colonoscopy and found out that there was no mucosal healing and I was still sick. Well, guess what? I was on the placebo, so lucky me. I was offered the opportunity to go on the open label, and I did, and immediately started feeling better. I think the most frustrating part of it for me was not being able to see like what my blood test results were in that time, because that's kind of confidential, but it's so worth it because I was feeling so much better. And I was feeling amazing. And I went in about 6 to 8 months later to do a colonoscopy. And I thought for sure I was in remission because there was nothing wrong. And unfortunately, I was healing from the symptoms were going away, but not the mucosal healing wasn't what they wanted to see. And so I did come off that drug, but luckily for me, I was trying a drug. I was on the trial was for a drug, and a new drug had come out during that trial that was very similar to it. And I can tell you that I am still on that drug today. And I am finally, for the first time as of last month, in remission. So, I may not have been a success story as far as for an actual drug, but it was a success for me because I was able to get better, and they were able to identify a drug that worked for me. And since then, several others have come out, so no surgery in my future. So, one of the things about being a clinical trial ambassador is that we get to talk about this stuff for other people and with other people. And, there are a lot of things that you're scared about, and you just kind of have to get past that, as easy as that may sound to say. That's exactly what I had to do. You have to ask a lot of questions, and, we really encourage people to, go try it, talk to your physician about it. If he does not bring it up to him, because a lot of physicians don't really, pay as much attention. Dr. Axelrad is an excellent example of somebody that probably does and probably mentions it to any patient that he has. And God willing, there are a lot more doctors like him out there. So anyway, that's pretty much my story in a nutshell. And I want to open it up to some questions from the audience, to Vishal, to myself, to Dr. Axelrad. And I encourage you to submit those questions in the Q&A box. And then we're going to try to get to as many of those as we possibly can until they tell me that I can't take any more. So the first question that we have is for Dr. Axelrad, and it is, what else can be done instead of constant colonoscopies?
Yeah, so I started answering some of these questions in the Q&A, but they'd be important for everyone to hear. We're not there quite yet for trials of a good surrogate for colonoscopy for many patients. And the reason in a trial that we force patients into these colonoscopies and whatnot is because exactly what we were talking about, which is we want to know, is there something unique about patients who respond or don't respond to drug? Is there something in that tissue biopsy? Is there something there like a biomarker that maybe for the rest of the IBD community, if this drug works and becomes approved, we could identify that this type of patient should take this drug? And so that's the unfortunate reality of trial colonoscopy. For everyday life, for patients who are on drug or thinking about drug or starting a new drug now, colonoscopy is really still the gold standard of assessing how patients are responding to therapy. We do have surrogates. We've all had these tests done, MRIs, fecal calprotectin, stool tests, blood tests for CRP and sedimentation rate, inflammatory biomarkers. These are just surrogates. So of course, we can check them, they give us good information, but always that gold standard of demonstrating, has the gut healed is going to be that scope, but we're not quite there yet as in trials as having a replacement.
Excellent. Well, question number 2 is, my provider says I'm not eligible for a trial. What can be done for trials to be more inclusive of those with differing symptom sets? So
this is really important. So first is that, participating in a trial is a little bit like dating, right? We've all done it. And so you need to, the trial folks, they want to make sure you're the right person for the trial. You're going to come to all of the visits. You're going to want to participate, in everything, that you're going to follow up. You're going to answer the questions. And also the study, you as a patient need to be aware that you're going to have to do all this work, and you're going to want to have to go to doctor visits. You're going to have to get stuck for blood. You may have to undergo multiple scopes. And so there has to be this sort of mutual acceptance. And because there's a lot of work that's involved, they want to make sure that the drug that they're going to be studying is being given to the right person. And so, right now, we don't have a lot of drugs that are being used in multiple different sort of symptom phenotypes or symptom presentations of IBD. They really a lot of them really want to focus on you're either moderate to severe and you have this sort of phenotype, or you're mild to moderate with this sort of phenotype. We are seeing more trials that are focused on various IBD subtypes, whether it's complications. Now we're seeing more trials focused on Crohn's fistula, right? And a lot of patients with fistula felt very neglected from a lot of trials that really had nothing really focused on them. We're seeing trials now focused on post-op Crohn's patients, right? So anytime a Crohn's patient goes to surgery, we just sort of restart an old friend. And now we're starting to see new drugs that are really focused on this population. If your doctor doesn't offer trials and you're interested in at least knowing what's out there, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov and you can search for disease types and sites that are participating in trials. And also, let's not, give Google too much credit, but you can always go to Dr. Google and see what sites are participating, right? If you go to my website or NYU's website, you can see all the trials that we're participating in. You can go to, Michigan's website and see all the trials they're participating in. And these are great resources.
Yes, in the Crohn's and colitis page for the Ibd Trial Finder, that's an excellent resource also. So, and Dr. Axelrad, I have to say, you have a patient that's on here that's one of yours, a new patient that's getting ready to join a clinical trial with you. So thank you to the patient, and I'm excited to hear how that turns out. I hope you both have good results with that. Now, for patient ambassadors, for either of me, and I'll let Vishal take it first, and then I can answer. Are either of us currently participating in any type of research now? And if not, would you do another clinical trial? So Vishal, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so currently after those 2 clinical trials, I haven't been selected or my doctor hasn't felt I've been needing to be in any other clinical trial. I'm actually currently on an approved medication. And so we're kind of seeing how the dosing is going and seeing how that's going. But if, the time comes, or if the clinical trial opens, which I would be eligible for and it'd be a good fit, per my doctor's recommendation, no issue. I'd be happy to join, because at the end of the day, if it's something that will help me, I'm all in.
I would do it also. Right now I'm in remission, so I'm not having to worry about that right now, but that's the first thing that I will do. I'm taking part in things like I'm working with a pharmaceutical company, large pharmaceutical company, and I'm acting as a go-between between the scientist and the doctor and the patient, because a lot of times I feel as a patient, we don't understand all the big words, and there's a lot of slides and there's a lot of information, And for me, I wanted to dig a little deeper and be a part of something that would help in that way. So I do a lot of speaking and talking to people and kind of acting as an interpreter of sorts. Scientists don't get to see the patients as much, and they like to be heard and talked to from the patients to keep them motivated also. And I'm also writing a book, a patient-to-patient guide for clinical trials for not just IBD, but clinical trials in general. So anyway, that's what I'm up to, but I would absolutely do another clinical trial. For Dr. Axelrad, it seems physical activity and exercise can improve immune function in both healthy adults and those with disease. Are there exercise-focused clinical trials in the United States?
So there have been a couple of studies looking at exercise as it relates to depression and some disease outcomes. But remember, when you're looking at a clinical trial or a trial generally, what you're studying has to be measured very carefully, right? So, I'd like to say I'm like an exercise person, but I'm not. So, me exercising may be very different perhaps than another patient exercising. And how you measure the impact of that exercise, whether it's changing the metabolic demands, whether it's changing immune function, is very different. And so a lot of these non-pharmacological based studies are very hard to quantify the impact. And that's why they're more difficult to study and why we don't see a lot, of studies focused on this.
And I think with IBD, every patient is different in how they respond. Because for me, if I work out, I feel tremendously better, where I have people that if they work out, they can't even move, so it's very different. This is a very difficult IBD. Why you chose that is amazing. And I'm glad you did. Let's see, for the ambassadors, were your family supportive of you joining a trial at first? Go ahead, Vishal.
Yeah, so like I said, my kind of dual clinical trial experience was a bit atypical because the drugs were already approved. That's not the common case, but it was for my case. And so that definitely helped ease my parents' hesitations or questions because they'd already been given to people and shown to be pretty safe. And the drugs themselves didn't have too many side effects. But I think the best way to kind of answer any hesitations that one's parents or oneself might have is just through learning more and asking more questions, just getting a clear idea of what's going on, what can I expect, and so forth from there.
My husband was absolutely, and my son, they were both great. And they encouraged me, because for me, coming off of The Biggest Loser and after just losing 100 pounds to then being on steroids to gain back that weight and suffering a lot of mental, depression because of that, it really helped. And, I think we were all a little nervous in the beginning, but my husband was like, you know what? Put the pill in your mouth, swallow it, and do it. And I'm glad I did. And, a lot of people have a misconception that the drug's never been in a person before. It's like, I think that's the biggest question that I get is, is it going to kill me right away? Am I going to put it in my mouth and I'm going to be gone because it's never been tried? When really so many steps have happened before it even gets into a human being, and people don't understand that. So I had a very, very good support system. And like I said, I'd do it again. Now, Dr. Axelrad, you have another one for our patients with Crohn's disease who have a J pouch, unable to participate in clinical trials.
So for most clinical trials, folks with a J pouch are excluded, and in particular, Crohn's of the pouch. So there are a couple of trials out there focused on pouchitis. So if you have a J pouch and pouchitis, you could be a candidate. Crohn's of the pouch is obviously unique, and that's even to this day, we are trying to figure out the right way to define that type of disease. And so, unfortunately, there aren't many trials that are focused on pouchitis, and none really out there focused on Crohn's of the pouch. But hopefully, in the future, there will be trials that are focused on that disease subtype. And if at the very least, if there's no trials, there's likely to be data where some of our drugs that are approved in Crohn's, colitis, or pouchitis will be tried in patients who have Crohn's of the pouch to assess whether there's real world efficacy, perhaps outside of a clinical trial structure. But it's a good question, and there's unfortunately limited options.
Now, also for you, Dr. Axelrad, what resources do you share with your patients? And those that are interested, at least in clinical trials for IBD?
So it depends, right? So it depends on the patient, right? So it depends on the relationship with the patient as well, and sort of how, whether I think and the patient's up to participating in a trial, whether there's a need for participating in a trial, right? And so once we've sort of established whether there's a need, a want, and mutual understanding, then usually I sort of evaluate what trials I have that I'm providing in my own center, what trials need to recruit, what would work best for the patient, right? At the end of the day, what we're doing is for you, right? It's for the patient, it's for the IBD community, it's not for the drug company. And so we have to make sure that it's the right fit for the individual patient. And then once I figured out what that is, then we talk about what the options are. And if I don't have a specific trial at my center specifically that I think a patient needs, then I refer to them to another center where that option is available. But before sort of just sending out a laundry list of trials that are available, usually I try to figure out what's right for the patient, what does the patient want, and then we go from there. We have signs in every room in my office that say, like, ask us about research, ask us about participating in research and trials, right? There's more than just trials out there, but that's an important one. But just flipping through a list may not be the best approach. It may be having a conversation with your doctors and what he or she may feel is the right fit.
That's great. Well, in Dr. Axelrad, you have been answering a lot of the questions. Your fingers must be hard at work while we are going through this also. So you've answered a lot of things already online. So there's a lot of great information shared tonight. And I really, really want to thank you for your expertise in this, Dr. Axelrad. And we can't do any of this without our sponsor, and Ferring Pharmaceuticals. We want to thank you for being our sponsor this evening. So for more information, we do encourage you to check out the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation's website at crohnscolitis.org/clinical-trials-community. I know it's a long word, but you can find it. And you can find specific resources for IBD clinical trials there, and a host of other information. And you can also, if you prefer to use the phone, you can call the Ibd Help Center, and you can talk to a specialist about any IBD related need. And the number for that is 1-88-MY-GUT-PAIN. And I think that is on a slide as well. So it's again, 1-88-MY-GUT-PAIN if you prefer to use the phone. And I would like to remind everybody, if you could please fill out the evaluation form, the survey that will be sent to you after tonight's program. We really, really appreciate the feedback. It helps us plan for future programming and everything that we do with the foundation. And before we do say goodnight to everybody, I want to invite you to join us on Friday, May 20th. It's at 1 p.m. Eastern time. There's a Facebook Live on Clinical Trial Awareness Day to discuss the myths and the facts of clinical trials. And I think that's going to be an excellent place to see information about the do's and the don'ts and the yeses and the no's for clinical trials. So check out the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation Facebook page for more information. And again, thank you, Dr. Axelrad. Thank you, Vishal, for sharing your story. And we appreciate you all coming, and have a great evening.